Joanmarie Bañez is a PhD candidate in literature with a focus on critical gender studies at the University of California, San Diego. She is from Atlanta, Georgia, where she completed her BA and MA in English Literary Studies at Georgia State University. Her research interests include 19th century racial formation and 20th century and contemporary multi-ethnic literatures of the United States. Specifically, her work examines Asian American diasporas in the US South, transracial adoption narratives, queer kinship, domestic labor, and care work. Her work can be found in the Georgia Review and the South Atlantic Review. Moon Cassinelli is assistant professor in English and Women's and Gender Studies at Virginia Tech, where he teaches courses in Asian American Studies, Ethnic American Literatures, American Literature, and Gender and Sexuality Studies. His research focuses on Korean diasporic narratives in media, transnational adoption studies, transnational feminisms, and queer kinship. His work has been published in WSQ, Women's Studies Quarterly, the Georgia Review, and Studies in American Humor. Al Evangelista is an assistant professor of dance and comparative American studies at Oberlin College. His diverse body of work has earned him a recent dancing lab at the National Center for Choreography. Congratulations, supported by the National Endowment for Arts, Daring Dances, and an Oberlin College teaching grant. Last but not least, Jay Shalat is assistant professor of English at Ursinus College, where he teaches courses in contemporary literature. His work can be found or is forthcoming in Mellis, Studies in American Fiction, TSLL, the CEA Critic, and elsewhere. He's currently working on a book project that examines the effects of post-9/11, the effects post-9/11 socio-legal policies have on kinships and domesticities of color. From wherever you are, I hope you can join me in welcoming our wonderful panelists. And Joanmarie, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Sorry first if my Wi-Fi is a little unstable. It looks like it should be okay for now. I'm also going to be sharing some slides really quick, so just give me one moment. Okay. Everyone see my screen? Okay. All right, so my title of my paper today is Belabored Beloved, the Kinship of Mammy and Lola Figures in Contemporary American Literature. In an article by People magazine, Melissa Tizon spoke of her late husband's intentions when writing the controversial essay, My Family's Slave, a personal essay wherein Alex Tizon reflects upon his family's relationship to Eudocia Tomas Pulido, or who he knew as Lola, as both beloved caregiver, but also as he revealed his family's slave. In June 2017, the posthumously published essay quickly became The Atlantic's most read piece that year, garnering critical acclaim for its sentiments about the bonds and bounds of family. Several readers, however, criticized the essay for its apparent injustice toward Pulido, the woman who in no small part raised Tizon and his siblings. With both Tizon and Pulido having passed on at the time of the essay's publication, the piece has come to memorialize their relationship to the home, the Filipinx and American labor histories, and to each other by way of speculative discourse. Responding to this discourse, Melissa Tizon stated, quote, "People say our family romanticizes the slave and slave owner relationship," she explains. "But the best way I could describe Lola's relationship with the family is like the dynamic of the family in the movie The Help," end quote. Further, Tizon's children, stepdaughter Dylan and daughter Maya, loved being with Lola, Melissa Tizon states, quoting, "She loved being with them. So it was really just nice to see, finally in her 70s, where she could really enjoy being like a real grandma, a real part of the family without feeling guilty about it and without feeling like she had to do all the work in the house," end quote. Invoking the film adaptation of Stockett's 2009 novel, Tizon is attempting to assuage criticism, ideally humanizing both the authors and Pulido's relationship to one another within their family dynamic. However, as scholar Mickey McAlia notes, to connect the essay to The Help is a euphemizing move that still yet displaces and obscures the power dynamics that Pulido was tasked to navigate. The commentary positions Pulido into a category of as-if family, a binary position that prioritizes the sentimental and elides any meaningful recognition of subjugated labor. The inclination for Tizon's wife to reference the help, as well as the urge from scholars such as Michaelia to insist upon a deeper analysis of these connections, points Filipinx labor history scholars, Black studies scholars, and scholars of US nationalism and domesticity towards new ways of languaging and understanding processes of racialization that center kinship relations and invoke logics of benevolent paternalism associated with the 19th century US South. For instance, when quickly searching for the novel's publication details, my search concluded with the German title for the help, Gut Geister. The title, which translates to good ghosts, uncannily speaks to the potentialities for injustice when systems of labor and their accompanying histories are euphemized within discourse surrounding the family or family-like relationships. Through a discursive analysis of My Family Slave, this paper seeks to illuminate an already established intimacy between the inherited legacies of domestic and enslaved labor across Filipinx and Black histories in the US. What emerges when Filipino stories of live-in care work journey through an analytic historically specific to the US South? What might these routes of storytelling reveal about the cultural problematic that continues to produce semblances of the mammy figure when discussing kinship and labor together? In this paper, I inquire into what I identify to be an articulation of a Lola figure. I consider how Lola, Tagalog for grandmother, can be read as a distinctly Filipino-American figure whose positionality as a live-in domestic worker, caregiver, and in some cases, ward to their employer, appears as simultaneously in excess and in loss of clear positionality of mother, grandmother, employee, and at times servant or slave. I read My Family Slave along Bridget Fielder's work on ersatz kinship, specifically related to the mammy figure, to configure a distinct queer genealogy of kinship. Inquiring into the logics that intimate and intermingle the two figures, I demonstrate how Tizon's essay engages in the act of co-constituting mammy and Lola figures, but also how acknowledging this discursive co-constitution unsettles settler colonial logics of wardship and benevolent paternalism. Ultimately, I conclude that examining kinship and labor together affords a reading of residual tenets of hospitality, warmth, and care made possible by women who occupy a space of subjective excess in relation to the families for whom they care. To analyze mammy and Lola figures together is to critically consider the material and affective conditions of their domestic servitude. To contextualize the figures' distinct orientations to hospitality and hostility across time and space, I utilize trans-Pacific non-encounter as a framework that situates mammy and Lola figures in relation to one another. As Yenle Espiritu, Lisa Lowe, and Lisa Yoneyama write on trans-Pacific entanglement, such a method, quote, calls upon us to link apparently separate subjects, contexts, and issues whose connections have been rendered unavailable by existing geographical, political, and disciplinary boundaries, end quote. Building off of trans-Pacific critique, such as work by Andrea Mendoza, I use non-encounter as a distinctly trans-Pacific framework to demonstrate how, when read together, mammy and Lola figures restructure labor, gender, and the family as an arena for the production of American national identity, simultaneously posing, quote, new problematics for their representations, end quote. Trans-Pacific non-encounter situates Filipinx labor histories and Black histories of enslavement, indentured servitude, and domestic work in the US South as already entangled in literary critical contexts. This work forwards a multi-perspectival understanding of gendered racializing logics that are influenced by benevolent paternalism and wardship. Narratives about domestic labor allow for us to locate structures of feeling that determine kinship relations by way of focusing on the often unspoken but understood dynamics of coercion, consent, and material and affective precarity. Liberal sentiments of freedom, gratitude, and indebtedness not only narrate these stories, but also frame the lenses through which mammy and Lola figures are memorialized. Fielder establishes the critical framework of ersatz kinship to analyze the representation of interracial family dynamics between Black and white individuals in 19th century American literature and culture. Ersatz kinship, Fielder writes, is, quote, a coerced product of slavery meant to mask slavery's violence by perpetuating the lie of enslaved people as contented members of their enslavers' families, while also obscuring the fact of enslaved Black women's kinship to their own biological children, end quote. The term narrates the striations of logics that organize the mammy figure's ubiquitous representation in the mid to late 19th and throughout the 20th century. Depicted as a devoted and loyal maternal figure to her young white charges, this very imagery established and perpetuated stereotypes that Black women were suited for subservient labor. Ersatz Kinship locates the family as a site of non-encounter for both Mammy and Lola figures by highlighting how the rhetoric of familial ties to one another misrepresent, overrepresent, and often intentionally occlude the employer-employee or master-slave relationship underlying the care work these figures perform. Pulido's obituary highlights this, quote, "It was an odd relationship from the beginning. Miss Pulido served as mother, sister, and protector, sometimes standing in for Asuncion, Tizon's mother, when the colonel punished her for misbehaving," said Tizon, end quote. I use the term devotional domestic to highlight the dynamic in which the reproductive labor that Filipino workers such as Pulido perform appears to be naturalized, and which their stories then sensationalize particular structures and politics of feeling regarding their labor. The polarizing reviews of My Family's Slave demonstrate the varying interpretations of Tizon's writerly choices to frame Pulido as innately caring but not subservient, and even more so, dignified in her domestic labor. Both Tizon and some reviewers, though, fail to contextualize Pulido's work beyond a framework of pseudo-mothering, reifying the centrality of the normative nuclear family. Said otherwise, Tizon's essay does the work of naming the figure of Lola and narrating a set of sensibilities that accompany her. Pulido is addressed as Lola, the devoted domestic worker who raises Tizon and his siblings, who cooks their meals and who cleans their home, indeed as an enslaved live-in care worker, but one who nonetheless rises to the occasion effectively and affectively. Tizon writes his memory of Lola onto the page as a woman who, despite her odds and circumstances, treats Tizon like family, to the point that she ultimately becomes family. The configuration of the devotional domestic, particularly and practically, requires the prepositional despite, rather than looking at or looking to the circumstances in which Pulido becomes enslaved and remains in a position of wardship under Tizon's tutelage after the death of Tizon's mother. The story of the devotional domestic is a looking beyond. Tizon's narration of his relationship with Pulido takes on a rhetorical space of post rather than ongoing inheritance of enslaved labor. And at its core, stories of the devotional domestic are sensationalized as already conferred inheritances. Their legacies, their work, are already done by having already performed her labor of love, and in these cases, they demand the correlation between the two. The devotional domestic then emerges as a literary figure who does not and dares not speak for herself, because she apparently would have nothing to say about the matter. She is remembered because she is already grateful and already honorable. Her memory resides on an altar, bright enough to offset the plausible shadow of ingratitude. When taking a break from writing the previous paragraph, in the comfort of my childhood home, my mother glanced at my computer screen and said, "Oh, Pulido, I know that name. That means you work nicely and nice and right." Kind of like a good job, or even the word polished. As a literary studies scholar, I'm inclined to read the poetry of the unwritten and elided. To the speculative close reader, to include Pulido on the cover would become something of an unwittingly sly admission. Accompanying the polished picture of Lola's good is the invisibilized and unwritten job. It is notable that while a portrait of Pulido is on the cover of the June 2017 issue of The Atlantic, her name appears nowhere on it. Centered instead is the title of the essay in the black and white cover photo. Pulido wears a zip-up sweater and pants with her silver hair pulled back. She sits with her head pointed toward the reader's left. Posed with her hand crossed over and holding her right wrist, she gazes into the distance. Across her chest overlays the caption, "Lola was 18 when my grandfather gave her to my mother as a gift. We brought her to America. For 56 years, she toiled in our home." Below the caption is the essay title, bold and capitalized. Not unlike the demographic information included in an individual's mugshot, Pulido is arrested by the information laid across her bodice. 18 years old, serving 56 years. The cover's aesthetic sensibility is that Pulido is Lola and Lola is, in all caps, my family's slave. The title, and thus Lola's title, juxtaposes the demeanor presented in her portrait. One could attempt to make a myriad of effective assumptions about her facial expression, her hand placement, and even her posture. I refrain from attempting this kind of visual analysis, though, because, as Zine Yao has asserted regarding the limits of effective analysis, the portrait image captures Lola in the context of already, after. Ultimately, the rhetorical purpose of the aesthetic sensibility of the photograph does its job. The dignifying image is contrasted by a history in which a woman's personhood is rendered excess, her labor a gift. Several reviewers of the essay argue it is necessary to contextualize Pulido's experience through Filipino Catalan culture and the Filipinx domestic labor diaspora. Historian Vicente Rafael highlights how Pulido's distinct relationship to domestic servitude, quote, arises within a household made up of working-class immigrants of color, rather than, say, a white-black situation. Further, when people hear the word slave in the United States, of course they would put an American frame on it. But the thing is that the word slave fits into many different frames. There's certainly an American frame, but there's also a Filipino frame, end quote. As Raphael has codified, it appears that while readers have routed their coming to terms with the essay through a critical framework of ersatz kinship, the reflections and even claims to Pulido's narrative position American and Filipino histories of labor and enslavement as mutually exclusive. I notion that while the histories are incommensurate, the multitude of discursive claims to my family slave demonstrates the production of Lola and a Lola figure that cannot be understood only through the Philippines or the United States, and especially in conflation with the enslavement of Africans and African Americans in the US South. And yet still, Melissa Tizon's remark on the help is remarkable, where the one-drop rule articulates when inherited Blackness is made central and ultimately defines Black subjectivities within racial taxonomies. This logic of hypodescendance has continued to produce derivations of mammy figures that oversaturate literary and cultural representations of the benevolent subservience of domestic workers within the American home. To say that Pulido's relationship with the Tizon family is like the help is an effective rhetorical move, but not one that merely establishes new connections. It is one that plays on already internalized representations of domestic labor within the US, one that intimates sentiment to an audience already familiar with the particular narrative of ersatz kinship. In other words, understanding the utility of Tizon's connection is a litmus test for locating where Pulido's narrative is landing for readers, how Pulido becomes a Lola, an effigy of her own story, and one that readers feel the impetus to lay claim to. In this paper, I have deprioritized a comparative analysis of Mammy and Lola as figures with established areas of literary study with equal genealogical grounding. Instead, this paper has demonstrated the significance of literary scholarship that speculates how the figure of the Lola is a product of discourse that supplementarily interweaves Black histories of enslavement in the US South alongside Filipinx labor histories. This line of inquiry, the tie that binds the figures to one another, is one that emerges from witnessing my own mother be called Lola by some members of our family. I grew up in Georgia, in and out of the home of my mother's former employers, a white American couple who I call mom and dad, a couple my mother also calls mom and dad, because to some degree, they were and are each of our parents. My mother was never enslaved, but she was a domestic worker. And while she is my mother, I have never called her mom because mom was already mom in our family. The experience is confusing, to say the least, and as mom's children grew up to have their own, I adjusted to a new dynamic, one that now includes watching my mother vacillate being called Lola or by her given name by the new little ones who do not know better or otherwise. My nephews call me aunt or auntie and call my mother Lola or Lita. There's no consensus between the children, though, and we often have to remind them to pick one. It must be confusing for them, or maybe not. They are boys still learning language as well as what family looks like and feels like. I think, who will my mother become to them, and who is she already? And I share this anecdote to conclude that the figuration of Lola emerges as a distinct Filipino-American subjectivity in need of deeper consideration in real life and on the page. While Eudocia Tomas Pulido was not Filipino-American, the memorialization of her story, or Tizon's proximate narration of it, and the many voices who identify with her story as similar to their own, begs the question, who, figuratively, is Lola? And what narratological work does she perform for the reader, even in death? Readers, including myself, have felt so compelled to stake a claim to her, and to what she might represent for them. After all, it was the most read piece in The Atlantic in 2017. Yet ultimately, we must steep ourselves in what this might mean, all while considering how to crane our necks beyond the family picture to see her better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanmarie, for that amazing, amazing paper. Silas, shall we turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you. Okay. I will be reading off my screen, so I apologize for what might be the limited eye kind of contact and connection. But yes. Okay. Thank you to Joanmarie Bañez for co-organizing today's panel and assembling this group. I'm so appreciative of what my co-presenters in our chair, Joo Ok Kim, have to share on kinship and inherited legacies. And thank you all for joining us in discussion through ASA's YouTube channel. I'm grateful for ASA's support and resources in rescheduling our annual meeting panel, and especially to Christine Schell, the ASA Program Coordinator for Media and Public Scholarship, who's overseeing today's logistics. I want to acknowledge that I cannot talk about kinship and inheritance without saying, wherever I am, I'm a visitor, guest, and settler on Native lands. After being adopted, I was sent to the US and raised on the land and waterways of the Narragansett tribe, the, in their own words, quote, descendants of the original Aboriginal people of the state of Rhode Island, end quote. I live and work on the Tutaloo Monacan people's homeland and waterways on what is known as Virginia. My current circumstances are made possible by state violence, including the revenue and resources extracted from enslaved Black individuals, and later legislation such as the Morrill Act of 1862 that helped establish my employer, Virginia Tech. Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty empower Native peoples, including the Narragansett tribe and the sovereign nations of Virginia, with rights and powers similar to and sometimes beyond those wielded by the state. As such, it's important to note that tribal-state relations are ongoing. Today's project is something I've been carrying with me since finishing my dissertation about 5 years ago, yet this is the first time I've had a chance to write and present on Theresa Hak Kyung Cha's experimental novel, DICTÉE, published in 1982. This is to say, my presentation today reflects early thinking, but I hope to share the questions and initial interventions I'm bringing to the text through close reading methods to think about inheritance as a scholar of Korean diasporic narratives, transnational Korean adoption, and queer and feminist kinship formations. In these opening acknowledgements, I'd also like to name Tim Cox, who worked as a student researcher assistant for me during summer 2021. Invaluable conversations with Tim helped to materialize today's approach to the text, staying with incoherence. A mixed genre text, Cha's DICTÉE is part autobiography, part prose poetry, interspersed with visual elements, including portrait photography, images of landscape, medical diagrams of the body in Eastern and Western traditions, and handwritten content by the author and others. When I first encountered the book, I immediately felt intimidated. As a Korean transnational adoptee and junior scholar of the Korea diaspora, I felt as though I didn't know enough about Korean history to experience a text, let alone understand it. The question of history, its roles, and its influence on the text is the center of important established works such as Women Native Other, Writing Post-Coloniality and Feminism, 1989 by Trinh Minh, Writing Self, Writing Nation, a collection of essays published in 1994, edited by Elaine Kim and Norma Alarcon, as well as a chapter in Anne Anlin Cheng's The Melancholy of Race, 2001. The women at the center of the text, Cha herself, Cha's mother, and Korean activist Yoon Kwon-soon, who was killed by Japanese soldiers for leading the 1919 protest against Japanese occupation of Korea, represent the Korean diaspora through their various dislocations and experiences of oppression and erasure. Together, these figures represent the familial and generational dynamics that hold the text in tension with itself, offering an anchor or counterbalance to the various voices, storylines, and intertextual references that run throughout the prose. Although the text features brief instances of Korean language characters, DICTÉE is predominantly written in French with translation in English. Language is representative of the colonial oppressor, while at the same time, as Laura Huang-Yi Kang argues, quote, there is a painfully honest acknowledgement here of the futility of an easy and immediate return to an untransformed Korean past in mother tongue, end quote. Therefore, a discussion of DICTÉE begins with its inability to be contained or singularly defined through genre, language, nationality, or ideology. And yet, I, like many Asian American scholars, posit that DICTÉE is also a decolonial text that uses memory work and poetics to name and reclaim a Korean American history widely overlooked, without relying on the premise of a universal history, a form of history that Shelley Sung Wong critiques that seeks to, quote, write itself as a narrative of emancipation, which proceeds by way of an ethical developmental progress, end quote. Furthermore, as Joo Ok Kim's scholarship on the Korean War, which expands the limits of material documentation and narrative bounds of what might be considered family stories, today's presentation is interested in reading Cha's DICTÉE as a Korean War novel, despite the latter text's refusal to situate itself within a contained or consistent spatial and temporal periodization. Precisely for how DICTÉE could be characterized as, quote, family stories of the Korean War, which Kim describes as unorthodox, and significantly with the interpretive ability to make, quote, unfamiliar the presumed logics of kinship, end quote. I'm arguing that Cha's novel is a Korean War novel, less so with regards to historical and material content, but for the relationality and reading practices presented therein. What therefore serves as an inherited legacy of what it means to read DICTÉE as purposefully challenging and inviting the reader to activate the interpretive potential of feeling as though one is, quote, missing out, by asking what is inherited by engaging in processes of finding meaning in fragmentation and unknowability against histories of trauma, colonialism, and displacement. To put it another way, Laura Hyung-Yi King argues that DICTÉE is written to be, quote, a process of mutually active collaboration between the writer and the reader. In an act of kin-making, I'm curious as to how DICTÉE helps us to understand a similar process with others within and beyond the Korean diaspora through an act of witnessing and creating desire as a non-reproductive affective agent. This speaks to what Joo Ok Kim claims regarding queer multiracial kinships and how they offer, quote, gorgeously disruptive modes of undoing normative parameters of family, expanding ideas of not knowing who is kin, gesturing towards a relatedness and sociality that requires interdependent material care. I extend Kim's queer kinship formulations to DICTÉE with the help of Donna Haraway's Staying with Trouble to inform what I'm calling staying with incoherence. Haraway's decolonial feminist praxis, which Kim also recognizes, defines kin and kin-making beyond the strictures of family, ancestry, and biological procreation. Haraway's theorization helps me to name the generative presence of family within Cha's DICTÉE, especially when the familial and a broad sense of, quote, family stories helps to put language to a history that is otherwise erased or hard to name, without defining inheritance through lineage alone. Family, like history or identity, is incapable of representing a stable category. From the works of scholars like David Ng and Stephen Son, post-structuralist queer kinship formations resist any reading practice that positions narratives that emerge from within the domestic or familial as automatically at odds with the national and the state. Staying with incoherence, therefore, pays attention to the moments in DICTÉE in which relationality is made available through non-biological kin formation. Arguably, Cha asks this of her narrator, and by extension, the readers, when she discusses the conditions of a livable life and the slow death of sovereignty denied at the hands of state violence. Following a brief mention of Gwansun and the March 1st, 1919 protests against Japanese occupation of Korea, Cha writes, "Some will not know age, some not age. Time stops. Time will stop for some, for them especially, eternal time." Here, Cha is asking us to orient not around the idea of death, which the author names as inevitable, but the process of dying. And that's spelt out dy/ing. Equally, DICTÉE presents time as a constant that we are all subject to. We must answer to time. The question, one might imagine, is how can we witness the dying around us when time manipulates and erases what we perceive? Additionally, I see another question emerge from DICTÉE. How might desire, depending on how it's positioned and what we're able to perceive, prevent us from acknowledging others who might also be our kin? Desire, Cha writes, is a form of repetition, specifically that, quote, imagination harbors the desire of the object to unlimited repetition at each point from the beginning to the middle to the end, rehearses the desire repeatedly in preparation of the final performance, end quote. I see this desire make itself most apparent in a rare repeated motif within DICTÉE, a woman who is sitting in a row of seats, observing a scene before her. In this first instance, this woman appears on page 79. It's unclear where the woman is exactly, only that, quote, she could be seen sitting in the first few rows. The passage continues, she would be sitting in the first few rows, closer the better, the more. Better to eliminate the presences of others, surrounding better view, away, from which is left behind, far away, back behind, more for closer, view more and more, face to face, until nothing else sees, only this view singular, end quote. The context suggests that the woman is sitting in a darkened movie theater, but she could also be perhaps traveling in a train car. Later, in the second instance, the woman is verified as indeed sitting in a movie theater, although this time she's unaware that she's proximate to another person because she so strongly desires to submit to the timelessness created in her body. So in the second instance, Cha writes, it is an empty theater. The immediate familiarity upon entering the theater of that which is past in shadow and darkness. It is between seances. The light from the street reflects on the screen briefly while the door opens and closes at a deliberate speed. The steps are carefully measured when darkness resumes, moving closer to the screen, to the width of the screen, the depth. She is the same, sitting in the same seat 4 rows from the front and second seat from the left. It cannot be deciphered from her position and stillness whether she is waiting through the intermission from the previous seance or if she had just arrived. Her body is still, her mouth slightly parted as before. Her eyes look ahead at no particular object or direction. She does not notice the presence of another person in the same row. Within DICTÉE, memory, like narrative, has the opportunity to be with time, as opposed to the timelessness that I just described. But this also involves an act of resurrection of what is buried and a willingness to stay with the discomfort. So for Cha and DICTÉE, we must resurrect from the past, history, the old wound, to name it now as not to repeat history into oblivion. So I'm drawn to the way in which desire as a non-procreative, affective experience can preclude or make unaware those who are with us in the same row, and help us to understand how time is being manipulated because we almost answer to time. This is not an easy process, as Cha is representing through DICTÉE, through both the narrator and arguably to us as the audience. This process of resurrecting the narrative and resurrecting memory subsequently means that the narrator knows and does not know simultaneously. And staying with coherence means sitting with that discomfort, what we cannot know with certainty, but what we must pursue through narrative. So she, in the next page after the second movie theater, Cha writes, she knows durée. While she says to herself she does not account for the sake of history, simulated past resurrected in memoriam. She hears herself uttering again, re-uttering to revive, the forgotten, to survive the forgotten, supersede the forgotten. From stone, layers. Of stone upon stone, herself stone, between the layers, dormant, no more. She says to herself she would return time to itself, to time itself, to time before time, to the very first death, from all deaths, to the one death, one and only remaining, from which takes place annunciation, a second coming. So here I'm closely reading the caution that to survive the forgotten, supersede the forgotten. But we must resurrect the narrative and retell from stone, of stone, for no more. And so today's presentation was thinking about how seeing our kin as a queer formation is to see DICTÉE as a Korean War text that has the ability to, as Joo Ok Kim posits, unsettle the war's conscription into otherwise familiar nationalist rehearsals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Silas, for that marvelous reading of Theresa Hak Kyung Cha's DICTÉE. Al, shall we turn it over to you?
Sounds great. Thanks. I'm just going to share this PowerPoint real quick. I am so honored to be here with all of you and so excited to be part of this panel. I'll say quickly that I've been working on a version of this text for an edited volume on dramaturgy and practice, edited by Dr. Caitlin Kane and Dr. Erin Stone King. So thank you to them for making this short version of the work possible. Dancing Inheritive Archives, Movement and Technology as Dramaturgical Practice. In this theater, audience members face one another. The stage separates viewers into two opposing groups. Audience members must make a choice about which side to sit on. Placed between them, in the center of the alleyway stage, almost as if forgotten, stands balikbayan boxes with red bamboo maps on top. A dancer cautiously approaches a mat, brushes it smooth, lifts their hand, and places their hand on the mat softly, at first, and then with the weight and lean of their chest. As they shift their weight onto the box, sound reverberates into the space. When the dancer's hand is removed and their body leans back, the audio abruptly stops with the sound of a record scratch. Sound and gesture are linked. With another weighted press, we hear a brief phrase, quote, "The exhibition is the first comprehensive display of the Filipinos," end quote. And then the announcement stops with another record scratch. Movement in this performance activates archival sound, analysis, and descriptions of people from the Philippines on display at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Some archives describe what happened at the 1904 World's Fair as a, quote, human zoo, and, quote, others as human exhibits. What matters is that this exhibit was rooted in the racist practices of eugenics. In this theater, dancers, their bodies, and their weight bring these archives into performance. This presentation explores my artistic direction, choreography, and dramaturgy for Somewhere Good, which intentionally activates archives relevant to anti-racism practices via choreography and augmented reality. Somewhere Good, an evening-length dance theater performance, originally debuted at Oberlin College with a cast of undergraduates. Through research and contextualization of the history of violence at the 1904 World's Fair, Somewhere Good invites audiences to engage with this complex history in a way that invites more choices, questions, and reflection. The production utilizes movement, technology, and a focus on marginalized voices to offer a counter-narrative to dominant discourses of anti-Asian hate and invite audiences to consider post-colonial perspectives. While this presentation is focused on a specific case study, my hope is that it will provide insight into the ways in which performance and performance dramaturgy can be used to interrogate historical and contemporary issues of violence, kinship, and injustice. By foregrounding the dramaturgical methods and techniques in Somewhere Good, I aim to provide one potential guide for artists and scholars interested in using performance to address similar issues. Theorists know that performance has the potential to generate new knowledge and new understandings. Dramaturgically grounded methods of inquiry can help us better remember the ongoing struggle against anti-Asian hate and other forms of systemic violence. With the resurgence of anti-Asian hate alongside the COVID-19 pandemic, many Asian American historians, academics, activists, and artists find ourselves repeatedly conveying a depressing fact. Anti-Asian hate is not new. In fact, anti-Asian hate is part of ongoing systemic violence linked to many tragedies spanning hundreds of years, from indentured workers in human zoos to hate crimes and threats against Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa. Violence against Asians and Asian Americans has been prevalent throughout US history and proliferates today. Yet how can this persistence and continuation of anti-Asian hate be forgotten or intentionally ignored? For instance, 300 years after Spanish colonization, the Philippines did not gain independence, but instead became a US territory. As a means of justifying this new colonization, the United States began a misinformation campaign describing how the US and its citizens were graciously saving the Philippines. Part of this political agenda and narrative was advanced by the 1904 World's Fair exhibit, which curated people from the Philippines to demonstrate why this rescuing was necessary. The archives of the 1904 World's Fair and this time perpetuate this colonial curation. Due to the predominance of colonizer perspectives included in the archives around this time, and the notable absence of Filipinx perspectives, the curation and framing of the archives largely fail to critique the influence on anti-Asian racism today and the stereotypes used as propaganda that remain in circulation. Somewhere Good's performance uses weight-activated audio and an augmented reality app operated by audience members to explore how to remember this traumatic history and to continue to move with its absences, its forgettings, and the ongoing practices of anti-Asian hate. In the first act, dancers move within the alleyway stage, reaching towards some invisible presence above, manipulating unseen objects, and being affected by seemingly imaginary forces. The dancers run searching for unidentifiable things underneath the audience member seats, while also dodging an invisible wall on stage. In the second act, all of the movements are the same, repeated exactly as the first. However, the audience is encouraged to use QR codes printed on the balikbayan boxes to access an augmented reality website, through which they will view the second act of the performance. Using this AR, audience members, through their mobile devices, are finally able to see what the dancers are avoiding, sliding under, and running around. The invisible wall that shaped the dancers' movement reveals itself as a wall of historical texts and shapes. The choreography, a mix of ambiguous gestures performed to synth pop beeps and recording of archival texts, remains open to multiple interpretations. There is still an element of something missing, but this incoherence is what the work is questioning and part of the dramaturgy. The dramaturgy originates in the ambiguity and the difficulty. Part of the dramaturgical problem here, especially when working with a flawed archive rampant with and perpetuating centuries of anti-Asian racism, is finding a way to communicate the hate contained in that archive and its incompleteness without perpetuating harm. Augmented reality offers one solution to reveal what is there, but not seen, what can be felt, but still invisible. To not endorse or further a singular lens on the experience, the movement itself and the augmented reality remain fragmented, a parallel of the archive itself. This can feel or be seen as frustrating, confusing, or maybe even boring, but that is the point. Can one invitation to remember this violence be sitting with this discomfort? This invitation to unknown things and things unseen manifests in moments that others might consider failure. For example, by not having a clear way to understand what elements of Filipinx American identity are readable on stage, I am trying to parallel the lived experience of choosing when and where to make historically marginalized aspects of one's identity visible. I'm trying to ask alongside the audience questions like, when do we invite curiosity into the unknown, and how do we cultivate this curiosity? How do we learn to embrace the unknown? How might dwelling in the unknown produce its own forms of knowledge? I'm going to end today by sharing a new AR experiment that you are welcome to try out if you have a mobile device nearby. This is definitely an invitation, not a required part of the presentation, but you can scan this QR code and eventually get to the screenshot on the far right. But to do that, you'll need to grant access to the camera, which you'll see in these first couple of screenshots to make sure you'll let the website work. But when the website has loaded, the option to place this avatar on a service appears. You'll click the little place button. And with this new AR movement project, I'm experimenting with being able to move in places where I cannot normally, and for you to document it. So again, with unknowns, places that I might be banned, where I can't move, you can even send me the screenshot and I will add it to the website and to the archive of photos. But to conclude, as you play around with the AR, if you choose to do so, this type of work offers one example of how performance movement and technology can create space for interrogating and challenging anti-Asian hate through research and practice, inviting audiences to engage viscerally and emotionally, allowing people to better understand the ongoing impact and complexities of systemic violence. Incorporating queer and post-colonial studies into the production's dramaturgy and design further challenges and disrupts narratives around race and identity, place and placemaking, offering an alternative perspective that prioritizes the voices and experiences of marginalized communities. Stories like these are never finished, and our perspectives on them are always changing. Maybe Bodies in Motion can help us write anew. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that gorgeous, gorgeous presentation. And after Jay's presentation and after the Q&A, I encourage everyone to check out the QR code that Elle provided for us. But Jay, shall we turn it over to you?
Great, thank you so much. I don't have an interactive thing. I do have a PowerPoint, but yeah, I'm so excited to be here and to talk to y'all. I'm gonna share my screen right quick, and then we can get started. I have a PowerPoint. Okay. And the little thing is above, so. Great, awesome. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Joanne, my grad school buddy, for inviting me to participate in this panel. This is a shortened version of a larger piece that's coming out this year or next year, whenever, with the Edinburgh Companion to Millennial Fiction. So, and I had to cut a ton, so I can expand on stuff in the Q&A. To be Desi, self-identifying as hailing from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and elsewhere in South Asia, to be a Desi millennial specifically, is to subject oneself to quotidian forms of racism in addition to other difficulties of prosaic life and the socio-cultural expectations bundled up in culture, ethnicity, and race. This paper focuses on the intersection of queerness and kinship in Desi millennial fiction, considering the kindred possibilities that flourish in acceptance. Sarah Thankam Mathews' novel, All This Could Be Different, begins with protagonist Sneha graduating college at the height of the economic recession, getting a contract job without health insurance, importantly, in Milwaukee, and deciding that she, quote, would be a slut, unquote. With economic and corporeal fulfillment, she has achieved quintessential millennial success, despite the socio-political odds her generation faces daily. Yet, she reassures the reader that, quote, this is not a story about work or precarity, unquote. But instead, it is trying, quote, to say something about love, which for many of us is not separable from the other shit. My focus on my paper's focus is largely on that other shit that she talks about. Love is inextricable from other shit: work, family, landlords, mental health, and financial burdens. This Bildungsroman traces Sneha's development as a queer, first-gen, working-class immigrant who becomes aware of the uneven power dynamics that make conditions of millennial life, as Gia Tolentino writes, quote, inescapable, ordinary, and perhaps increasingly toxic. At the same time, Sneha cannot escape the virtues of duty in a Desi family. Success begets duty, and she is expected to follow a sociocultural structure that fulfills her parents' wishes after they failed their American dream. Upon getting hired, for instance, Sneha sends money to her parents in India, a luxury she had previously never known. Indeed, the novel's structure partly follows the money. Temporality is measured financially, with brief notes about how much money is left in Sneha's savings account. Time here is money. This millennial credo is intimately linked with the protagonist's obligation to her Christian Malayali family back in India, sending money home. Single-handedly keeping her family and herself afloat, Sneha reverses the stereotype that millennials are forced to live with and financially rely on their parents because of housing and cost of living crises. Duty, however, extends beyond monetary support. Her parents also expect her to marry a man. Heterosexual matrimony solidifies success in her family. After accidentally seeing her best friend Tom aggressively have sex with his girlfriend, which Sneha describes in consumptive and animalistic terms, she thinks, quote, this is what my parents wanted for me, what everyone wanted, to be a dish laid out for a man's hunger, to be taken, to be quiet, disappear in time into marriage, into motherhood. In other words, Sneha's parents not only desire but expect her to continue her successful streak by falling in line with heteronormative ideals of feminine submission. In their conceptualization of family and duty, Sneha's mummy and papa, as she affectionately calls them, cannot imagine queerness within the realm of success. Sneha recognizes this early in the novel when she questions the limits of their wishes and whether she would adhere to them. She wonders, quote, how likely it was I would finally capitulate if I proved immovable in their desire for me to be taken care of, which for them meant the chosen marriage, the decent paid-for man. Anything else, let alone what I wanted, bringing shame on the family. I'm looking at my screen. Can you guys see all the quotes properly? Is it, or are heads in the way? I'm just wondering because I can't see my. Oh, there it is. Perfect. I'm going to do that. Great. Sorry about that. Shame is the antithesis of success. Therefore, she remains in the closet because, quote, her parents poured all their hopes into her, unquote, and she fears upsetting their already tenuous relationship. Remaining in the closet, at least to Mummy Papa, protects her family from social shame and allows Sneha to succeed and maintain duty. In keeping with the generic conventions of a Bildungsroman, All this could be different traces Sneha's development through her experiences with the world. Her successful rise follows her swift and inevitable fall and ascension again. The millennial is humbled when she loses her job and breaks up with her girlfriend Marina. Unemployment disrupts expectations. The lost job means Sneha can no longer financially support her parents abroad, and it takes a toll on her personal life too. Savings evaporate, romance withers, and depression eclipses. These tensions crescendo when Sneha cathartically, start that sentence over. These tensions crescendo when Sneha cathartically confesses her financial troubles to her mother on a late-night phone call. The confession, importantly, orbits duty and expectations that arise from the family's personal history of struggle. The scene subverts the coming out narrative. Sneha privileges revealing financial precarity rather than queer identity. Queerness remains hidden, for now, in fear of shame within her family and culture, and because financial difficulties are more urgent. She bemoans, "It feels so bad to tell you any of this," I gasped, "because of what you and Papa went through. I'm not a good child, and it's okay, I never have been, but I want to honor what you all did for me. Ma, I wanted to at least not cause you pain." Self-awareness, sorry. There it is. Self-awareness, I have never been, collides with duty, I wanted to honor, in Sneha's confessional. Note 2, the M dash that to indicate the abrupt ending of Sneha's outburst, a sword-like mark that illustrates the stab of disrupted expectation. Yet, in a moment of seemingly divine intervention, a job offer with health insurance catapults the millennial back into the graces of career success, though briefly. When her mother comes to America to help her move to DC, Sneha disrupts expectations yet again in, quote, the great terror and relief of being known when she comes out to her mother. The awkward and shocking discovery of queerness illustrates not only the extent to which Sneha successfully hid her lesbian identity from her mother, but it also reiterates that had the mother not entered Sneha's room, stepped into Sneha's closet, so to speak, the millennial would have remained closeted to her parents and preserved that illusion of success following job and financial security. Nevertheless, Sneha plucks up the courage, and though she stumbles, she comes out to her mother. Quote, I wanted you to know who I am, unquote. While Sneha never divulges the entire coming out conversation she has with her parents to the reader, she does reveal in the epilogue that her parents have reluctantly grown to acceptance. Mathews depicts coming out and familial approval as a non-linear wayward process. Sneha's parents go back and forth about her queerness. Her father entreats her to consider, quote, a lavender marriage, if nothing else. But her mother steps in with finality and says, it will not happen the way we hoped. Framed as such, her parents still structure their hopes and expectations around heteronormativity. To quote her mom, they don't know what to do with all this. Nevertheless, a singular desire to see their daughter settled trumps their hesitant acquiescence to Sneha's lesbian identity. Her mom pleads, quote, we want you to have somebody who will take care of you. The idea that no one will be there for you when that happens, my heart cannot take that. We want you to have a family, to have somebody, unquote. Family remains the framework through which her parents' acceptance of queerness operates, but it is a marked revision of previously held principles of heteronormative expectations and success. Rather than positing queerness as resistant, antithetical, and unbelonging to the nuclear family, Mathews' novel boldly proclaims that queer desire desi millennial can indeed remain in the natal kinship unit. As Shirley Royce notes, the result is a, quote, new kind of queer intimacies, families and feelings in and through rather than outside of or in rejection of the Indian family. In imagining these new forms of queer relations, Mathews presents the contemporary Desi family as wholly capable of refusing and breaking free from the sociocultural restraints of heteronormativity and of inventing queer ways of being and living into the fold. Put another way, the familial acceptance of Sneha's lesbian identity also expands, if not breaks, previously rigorous definitions of success and expectations. This newly defined understanding of self, upon coming out, familial acceptance, and achieving financial and career success, manifests in All This Could Be Different through a specifically Desi queer self-fashioning. The epilogue sees Sneha return to Milwaukee for her friend and ex-boyfriend Amit's wedding, where she meticulously dons a sari her mother gave her. On the one hand, the sari materially connects the women across thousands of miles, and on the other, it operates as a tool for self-definition. As Roy argues, dress and style, presenting oneself in a particular way, can be read as embodied and deeply pleasurable labor of the self. Roy approaches outward appearance through a feminist lens, claiming that such self-fashioning is important because, quote, women's expressions of desire, choice, individuality, and autonomy, and their ability to imagine what could be possible through something as everyday fashion, unquote. And while a Desi millennial in America wearing a sari is not seen as everyday fashion, Sneha's relationship with the yards of fabric represents her acceptance of herself as Desi and queer. She is out, brown, and proud. For Sneha, quote, the clothes become the details of her life story and a marker of time. Mathews describes the adornment scene through fragments to mirror the labor-intensive process of wearing a sari and to metaphorically index Sneha's journey coming to terms with herself. Quote, I pulled on the underskirt's drawstring, buttoned my blouse, began to pleat and fold and pin the yards of fabric. Then, in the downstairs bedroom, I pinned the sari to myself carefully. In my ears, I slid gold hoops, rubbed pomade through cropped hair. These details indicate the building romance telos. Sneha has emerged self-assured and confident in herself as a lesbian and Desi. As someone who can wear a sari with cropped hair, I surveyed myself, she says, found the image both hard-won and acceptable. Thus, as a queer Desi millennial bildungsroman, All This Could Be Different concludes with a resistance to sociocultural expectations whereby Sneha defines success according to her own norms. These norms, moreover, arise from a recognition that queerness and familial duty are not mutually exclusive, that Sneha can indeed be queer and a dutiful and loved member of her family. The final members of the book see Sneha on the floor of a bathroom after she learns that Marina, her ex-girlfriend, is getting married. The news physically pains her, and she believes she is alone, once again failing to achieve the expectations of settling that she and her parents set for herself. She fears for her own solitude. I think it's important to note that she's still wearing the sari at this point. But her best friend Tom, who before was the kind of representative of like hypermasculinity and heteronormative expectation, her best friend Tom comforts her, and aloneness turns to togetherness. It is then that I see it flicker before me like a promise, the empty room full of light. In the final lines of the book, Sneha frames her experiences in juxtapositions. This is my tragedy and my great good fortune, and to be the recipient of this bond, to be kept alive under its crushing warmth and weight, to be given it so freely, so much more than I have ever deserved. In doing so, Mathews presents what we might call a Desi refusal, resisting capitalistic heteronormative expectations of marriage and career as an act of transformation. For the queer Desi millennial, Mathews' novel asserts compartmentalized spheres of living rarely exist. Rather than neatly organized separate worlds, the personal and professional coalesce into a collage of blurred edges and overlapping and repetitive elements that are informed by familial and sociocultural expectations and notions of success. Indeed, All This Could Be Different's concentration on the inundated everyday is not a marked difference from other millennial novels that also explore the inextricability of work and romantic life, financial precarity, and familial relations. However, the novel deviates from much millennial fiction because of its ultimate affective and tonal shift away from anger and suspended character development. And here I'm thinking of novels about angry millennials like Luster by Raven Leilani, anything Sally Rooney ever wrote, And there are plenty of them. For instance, Stephanie Danler maintains that female protagonists of millennial novels, quote, bespeak a literary era that swung past genial pessimism into repulsion. The tone of these novels is a rebellion cut through with apathy. These women refuse to make themselves better, unquote. Sneha is quite the opposite. She dynamically makes herself better and happier by accepting and embracing a queer Desi world in which she can make a home. While Sneha certainly navigates the frustration and boredom in cubicle farms and the monotony and disappointment in swiping left and right on dating apps, she cannot escape the sociocultural and racial implications of Desi existence. In her words, quote, always I was aware of my own melanin. I say this without self-pity. Some people look at your skin as if they're preoccupied with how best to scrub it without being rude, unquote. For Desi millennials, race constructs restrictive visions about how to be. Importantly, these preconceived narratives about Desis are written and bolstered by communal and familial pressures and by non-Desis who stereotype. Mathews' novel and many other Desi millennial novels, like these on the slide, however, insist that Desis are not monolithic, that to be Desi is to be many things that don't fit in a pre-labeled box. What happens when we define success not by financial or marital status, but by the relationships we cultivate and nurture with each other and ourselves? In its emphasis on inclusivity and belonging, its admiration of queer families and intimacies, and in its disruption of heteronormative and capitalistic expectations, all this could be different imagines the Desi millennial existence as more than notions of financial, career, and marital success. To rupture and transcend those norms, to embrace a queer Desi life fashioned in your own terms, is defiance and liberation. This novel, and others like it, insist that renovating cultural norms and expectations and reinventing rubrics of sociability and being is a future-oriented endeavor. It demonstrates that the power of millennial fiction, it demonstrates the power of millennial fiction to reimagine, reconceptualize, and reconfigure methods of and foundations of togetherness. It dares to tell those most intimately related to us, family and community, that change and resistance are perfectly okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay, for that super presentation and for my the new books going on to my to read list. So I'm so honored to be part of this discussion, and I'm learning so much about the critical measures of temporality, the activation of stillness, the activation of movement, and activation of like punctuational disruptions from each presenter in each of your works. And I have a kind of broader question. It's not a question, it's me wanting to hear each of you talk more about queer intimacies within nuclear family units, as Jay just identified for us, queer inheritances as, especially Silas and Joe have presented for us in their works, and then queer intimacies across performance, across archives, and cultural productions overall. So again, I'm sorry that that's not a question. It's just something that I would love to hear each of you talk more about. And I do have a very specific question that I'm trying still to articulate from Joanmarie and Silas's presentations. So maybe we can start there, because I am very greedy and I wish to know, I demand to know your thoughts. And then we can move on to questions from the audience that Chris will share with us. So Joanmarie and Silas, I think it's so striking that both Tizon and Cha, obviously couldn't have anticipated each of you, specifically as you're situated in your kinship formations, as interlocutors of their works. And I wanted to ask if you'd consider saying more about your methods of close reading in relationship to your critical observations on inheritance, temporality, and resurrection. And in fact, that's versions of that question I would ask Jay and Elle as well. Oh, hello, Kitty.
Okay, thank you so much, Joo Ok. I guess I'll start because Joanmarie just put into the chat that her internet connection is unstable and then disappeared like a magic act immediately following. And so you had initially kind of presented the idea of queer intimacies within families. Hi, Joanmarie. Okay, you're back. So I'm responding to Joo Ok's inquiry about the way that we're intervening into the text and maybe the ways in which you and I are both methodologically in conversation with each other. And so much of DICTÉE is against a universal history. And what I'm really struck by is how scholars have spoken against a very familiar nationalist framework to fall back on, considering there are multiple voices and intertextual references, Greek tragedy, classic and kind of contemporary invocations happening simultaneously. And it can feel very disorienting on how to put yourself within the text. And so I've been so appreciative of specifically like Asian American feminist scholars who've taken, like what Al was talking about, a very kind of like decolonial, post-colonial, feminist, queer approach to thinking about the tensions that the history brings to the text. And yet, I don't want to collapse family as being at odds or at the level of scale or content as kind of naturally or inherently working against the state or the nation, because I think it's more complicated. And I think, Joo Ok, what you kind of prompted us to think about initially was that queer intimacies within families demonstrate exactly how complicated that can be. And so, and also though, I don't ever want to collapse narratives that come from within the domestic as being exclusionary in any way. And so that's why I'm thinking about how this tension around desire as a repetitive form, both in a positivist way and maybe in an isolating way through my close reading example, because I don't see like Clara Hahn's Seeing Like a Child, which is an incredible text, or Stephen Son's most recent Minor Salvages as also coming from within the domestic, as only working within the Korean diaspora, right? And so, and it was, I'm so appreciative to what Joanmarie did at the end of her presentation, because it is this kind of personal invitation to myself to not rely on these larger narratives of what history is, and to not let time lull me into the sense of timelessness, of just kind of suspension and feeling without the engagement and the materiality that Jay and Al's presentations brought forth. And so I think the familial can be this kind of point of resurrection, as well as I think all the scholars on the panel are trying to speak to the norms that have that come along with heteronormativity, right? Yeah. Joanmarie, do you want to add anything?
And I'm so sorry. I did drop my question in the chat, but I dropped it in all caps, so it looks like a really, panicky, a panicky request. Joe, are you frozen?
I think Joanmarie might be frozen.
Okay, maybe while Joe thaws, we could turn the my desire to like learn and know more to Al and Jay as well.
I can go right quick. I'm gonna go for your question about the idea of queerness in nuclear families. I think one of the things that I'm thinking through and like this larger piece examines is this idea that I'm all for the chosen family and the nuclear family. Like that is a thing that we were seeing a shift in queer theory certainly about that. It's in itself that and that's really what I'm building off, where I think what happens when we include queerness into the nuclear family structure, or does that mean it's still nuclear altogether? Like what does that definitional, how do those definitional debates start to work all over again when we incorporate that into like our traditional understanding of family? And it's just something I'm thinking through, and like the book that I was writing about, All This Could Be Different, so specifically does that and imagines a way in which this lesbian daughter is like, it's not the end all be all. That's the big discovery at the end. All this can be different, right? Like what we are familiar with, all this can be recapitulated or reimagined into something completely new. And that itself is an act of is a radical act, right? That goes against expectations set by culture, religion, nation, all of those different things. And so I really want to keep investigating that that line of inquiry. The chapter that this is part of didn't allow for that much room. But yeah, this is an idea that I'm toying with and I've been thinking about for a really long time now. So I'm really glad that I got the opportunity to talk about it and think through it with you guys.
Yeah, that was, I mean, based off of what you just said and your amazing presentation, and then also from Joe's amazing presentation, thinking about, I think Joe's words were deprioritizing a one-to-one equivalence. And so I'm trying to think about this in terms of the nuclear family question and Silas's use of the word collapse, because that's just such a like a dancer prompt. I feel like you need to go. But thinking about this in terms of Black feminism, particularly Bernice Johnson Reagan's idea of there are different groups for different reasons. And I guess I'm bringing this up because I'm going to the Philippines for the first time in about a month and a half. And I'm thinking about how I need to think about the groups that I'll encounter there and the different ways that I'll be in relationship in different family situations while I'm there, and how to do that in queerness and not queerness. Yeah.
I wonder too, and as Joanmarie is typing out her thoughts in case there's a mm, mm, the rudeness of the former biomedical library at UCSD and its refusal to grant Wi-Fi. I was, I'm so struck by, in your presentation, the idea of stillness and movement as both inviting different versions of queer intimacies. And I'm sorry if it's like such a basic question from someone who's not in dance and performance, but I'd love to. I was just so struck by that description and how this this sounds, oh, somewhere good. How somewhere good again like intentionally activates archives in relationship to both stillness and to movement.
Yeah, I guess it's also a question because it was something that I was dealing with in the rehearsal process and also just life of we move with these archives all the time, whether or not we know it. And so I tried to figure out a way to dance that. It also comes from Claire Croft's Dancers as Diplomats, thinking about the way that bodies themselves as they go to different countries and performances, how they negotiate and talk about politics.
Thank you. Joanmarie, do you think you would be with your camera off. Do you think you would be able to share your thoughts, and or one of us can read also your response if that would be better. And I'm so sorry that UCSD Wi-Fi is so terrible.
Oh,
I can read your response if you want, Joanne, because I think you're trying to speak, but it's not. Yeah. So Joanne is responding to the question about kinship. And she says, Munoz's disidentifications has been on my mind a lot lately. Makes me think of the negotiations and / navigation of the nuclear family unit when estrangement, for whatever reason, is not the immediate or viable option. To even have an active choice / part regarding the conditions of estrangement is a privilege in itself. That's a great point. But I'm thinking a lot about how ersatz kinship and excess of one family member can also open up opportunity for others who understand themselves to be part of the nuclear family unit to then negotiate how they relate to one another. This can look like changing or taking on or adapting different inherited roles such as mother, child, sibling, etc. She ended with, I hope this makes sense. I think it makes complete sense, and gets to this idea that I think tethers all of our presentations, like this idea of queer relationality and queer incoherence. And I think you've captured it perfectly in this.
And I hope we can save this chat so that,
Oh.
that the theoretical kind of brilliance of your response makes it into your very exciting dissertation. Chris has notified us that our YouTube audience is just so stunned by just the collective brilliance of this panel that they're still working through ideas and thoughts. I definitely also wanted to open up space for each of you to engage with your works, and I welcome also for some of us the shared histories and different contexts that we bring to this conversation too. So
I have a pedagogy question for y'all. How do you teach these different, like, what's the reception of this in your specific like higher ed context, right? Like, do you get to teach this kind of stuff? I'm always really interested in that because it helps me. I'm teaching a whole class on my book on my book right now, and it's like already so clarifying. And I'm curious, like, do you bring this into the classroom? How do you do it? How do students respond? If you could just kind of touch on this. Maybe Al, if you teach a choreography or a methods course or something, like, how does this work?
It's a great question. So I do it in I did get the advice too for research questions to somehow bring them into the classroom in order to get varying perspective. But I feel myself generalizing a lot more. It won't be as specific. So even as a movement prompt, what is something ambiguous that you want to move with? What is something unseen that you want to move with as an invitation? I find myself going back to that, and I also find myself going back to I've been dancing a lot with queer patron saints. So what is a queer patron saint that you want to start a practice towards? And that has been something that has, but I don't see myself going specifically into teaching a class about the 1904 World's Fair. That answers the question.
I also just want to add that the idea of a queer patron saint and what Joanmarie was talking about in terms of the devotional domestic is giving me so much to think about in terms of how spirituality and religion and Christianity are operating within DICTÉE, which I think, like so many of these frameworks, they have this overwhelming initial affective resonance. And then what I really appreciated about this panel is whether it's something like marriage or family or religion, we are palpating. I'm trying to think of like a gesturing, like an engagement. Thanks, Al. I'm trying to think of like a form of physical kinship that we're creating where like Joanmarie was saying, and like what was coming through so clearly in Jay's presentation, is that the turning away, even to sit with the presumption of turning away, like I expect this character to reject, I expect this character to radically resist, is something that's kind of getting worked through because of Muñoz's disidentifications, because of that really lovely Roy quote about the Indian family, right? And it's from my own training, it's such a queer post-structuralism without the collapsing, right? That is potentially the hard work, and I do think witnessing is the visual field. I mean, even as Joanmarie encouraged us to not overread demeanor and body position and facial expression and our own affect, I also think witnessing, I don't always use the word witnessing pedagogically, Jay, but I try to think like, even if you weren't taught a particular Asian American history, or unfortunately, even if you weren't taught Asian American history at all, that doesn't mean that you don't have an existing relationship. We've all been witnessing to our own histories and to other histories, whether we're kind of like, as Al was saying, we're with these archives all the time, whether we're conscious of it or not. And it's the layers that kind of get piled on top of each other that Joanmarie's presentation, so with the site specificity of the US South, kind of helps us kind of think through and dig through. So I do find that like spatial specificity, sightedness does kind of help anchor some of that pedagogy without feeling like I have to walk a class through literally hundreds of years of history of like, you didn't know this immigration law, you didn't know this immigration policy, maybe you didn't study this war as closely as you studied other wars, or maybe the Cold War logics have only oriented you in one way. And I think finding other affective ways to spread out what history is and how it's experienced helps in that pedagogical sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's so brilliant, Silas. Thank you. We do have a comment, I think, from Ben Bascom through the YouTube platform. And Ben says, thank you so much for these incredible talks. I'm not sure if this is ready to post questions, but I just really am inspired by the various methods, close reading, performance, family history, and that there is, there's a word limit on the platform, but he says, I just love the various approaches here on display and the compelling ways you're all thinking about questions of kinship. Thank you, Ben. I wanted to ask Joe if you wanted to respond to Jay's question about pedagogy, and well, whether or not Joe's able to kind of type the response to that question, I also want to ask Silas, have you taught DICTÉE? Yeah.
Yeah,
how does that go?
No, I haven't, not yet. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would love to, and I'm both like terrified.
That's I wanted to teach an Asian American lit class for so long now, and I was thinking like, because I just like look at my books when I'm bored, I I was looking at my bookshelves the other day. I was like, oh, I should teach DICTÉE. Like that would be a fun class. Like we could just, and I was thinking to myself, like, let's start with that. And I was like, no, let me chill out because then they're gonna be like, this is like intense. And so just because like formally and conceptually, like it's working on so many different levels. If you just open up the book at any page, you're like, what's going on here, right? So this idea of incoherence is inherent to the form of the text. But yeah, I'm really curious if anyone's ever taught it, even on the YouTube audience, if somebody like has taught it, they can chime in because your boy wants to know. Like that's really like that's what I want to know.
I do have an amazing colleague at Virginia Tech, Sophia Terazawa, who teaches DICTÉE and whose poetics are very diasporic in the Vietnamese diaspora, but DICTÉE is kind of like a go-to text, and I've been so lucky to have Sophia as a colleague and an interlocutor, and for Sophia, poetics is very much about is a poet and is also a performance artist, and so it's in some ways I'm grateful for routing myself through someone else's diaspora, which has felt really generative. So Joanmarie says about pedagogy, I teach Tizon's piece in an upper division summer seminar class. It was a super heavy piece, but students did find it rich and rewarding to read. I don't know if that's the right word, in parentheses. We talked a lot about their expectations, initial thoughts, what they are, and what their responses/reactions actually say about the stories, such as Polito's. Many of them were appalled and surprised, and we talked about why it was so. It was tricky, though, to discuss such a personal nonfiction piece, especially without Tizon or Polito to comment.
I think that's, oh, I can read the next part of Joe's response. Many of my students were also Filipino and Filipino American who had similar family structures, and it allowed them to think through what was normalized in their household and why looking back at it and critically considering it is important. Joe, I can't imagine what that experience might have been like. And I do think it is so important that students do think about like, what does it mean for us to encounter and grapple with and like respect the discomfort of engaging with this piece, precisely without Tizon or Polito there to comment that that's one of the, I think, scariest pedagogical challenges that we might each encounter. So any final thoughts from our amazing presenters? We have 1 minute. I really wish we were
So
together.
enriching. Thank you guys so much. This is great.
I learned so much. Joanmarie has joy and gratitude for us. And she uses y'all, which is important too. Well, thank you. Jay, any final thoughts? Sorry.
No, just thank you to Chris too for organizing the YouTube stuff and for everybody who showed up on YouTube. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Chris, we might end our session now, if that's okay. Thank you.